"Oh no, Bailey, not again!" The sound of my own voice startled me more than the sight in front of me. My golden retriever was at it again, furiously digging in the same spot in my backyard as if her life depended on it. Dirt flew in every direction, speckling her golden fur with patches of mud. Her tail wagged like a metronome set to overdrive, completely ignoring my protest. I let out a sigh and stepped closer. "Come on, girl. Enough with the digging." Bailey didn't even look up. I tried again, this time reaching down to gently push her away from the hole. She backed off just enough for me to see that the hole had grown even deeper than yesterday. I groaned. "Bailey, what are you looking for? There's nothing here." She responded with a quick bark and wagged her tail even harder, then dove right back in. I shook my head and glanced at the sky. The sun was starting to set, casting an orange glow over my quiet little neighborhood in Iowa. My yard wasn't anything fancy, just a well-kept lawn and a white picket fence enclosing it. I'd always taken pride in keeping it neat, which is why Bailey's little excavation project was beginning to drive me crazy. I'd filled the hole twice now, only for her to dig it back up the next day. I knelt beside her and ran my fingers through her fur. "Bailey, what's gotten into you, huh?" Her tongue lolled out as she panted happily, oblivious to my frustration. I rubbed her ears and sighed. "You're lucky I love you." Bailey barked in agreement, then immediately returned to her digging. Dirt piled up beside her, and my curiosity finally got the best of me. I grabbed a small garden spade from the shed and started digging alongside her. If she was this determined, maybe she had found something worth checking out. A buried toy? An old bone? Maybe even a rabbit hole. The further we dug, the more I realized something was buried deep down. My spade hit something solid. It wasn't a rock. There was a hollow sound, like wood. My heart skipped a beat. What in the world had Bailey found? I carefully cleared away more dirt. A wooden plank peeked through the soil, old and weathered. Bailey whined excitedly beside me, her paws scratching at the edges as if urging me to hurry up. My hands trembled as I brushed away the last layer of dirt and revealed what looked like the top of a wooden box. An old, locked chest. I sat back on my heels, staring at it. "Bailey, what did you find?" She gave me an expectant look, as if waiting for me to open it. A sudden chill ran down my spine. This was not what I had expected. Old wooden chests buried in backyards weren't exactly normal, at least not in my world. My mind raced with possibilities. Had the previous owners left it here? Was it some kind of time capsule? Or something more sinister? I swallowed hard and reached for the lock. It was rusted and weak. With a little force, I managed to snap it open. My pulse quickened as I lifted the lid, expecting something dramatic. Gold coins, secret documents, anything mysterious. But what I found inside stopped me cold. It was a bundle of papers, yellowed with age, wrapped in a faded blue cloth. My fingers hesitated before picking them up. Bailey sat beside me, eyes locked onto the box, as if she too understood the significance of what we had just unearthed. I unfolded the cloth carefully. The first page held a single handwritten sentence. "For the one who finds this, know that love never fades." My breath caught in my throat. What did that mean? Who had left this here? And why had Bailey been so desperate to dig it up? I turned the page and found an old black and white photograph tucked inside. It was of a young couple standing in front of a house that looked eerily familiar. My house. Bailey let out a soft whimper, nudging my arm with her nose. I could feel my heart pounding. This wasn't just some random box. It was a piece of history, buried right in my backyard, and now for some reason, Bailey had led me to it. I glanced around the yard, suddenly feeling as if someone might be watching. The trees swayed gently in the evening breeze, the quiet hum of crickets filling the air. My fingers tightened around the photograph as I looked back at Bailey. She wagged her tail slowly, as if telling me that this was just the beginning. And I had a feeling she was right. Bailey sat beside me, her tail thumping lightly against the dirt, her golden fur catching the last rays of sunlight. My hands trembled slightly as I carefully picked up the photograph, examining the faded faces of the couple. Their expressions were warm, filled with a quiet joy, as they stood in front of what was unmistakably my house, though the landscape around it was different, less developed, more open fields than fences. The edges of the photo were worn, the corners slightly curled, and on the back, in the same looping handwriting as the note, a date, September 12, 1954. I swallowed hard. 1954. More than half a century ago. My house was old, but I had never given much thought to its history beyond what the real estate agent had mentioned. A simple, charming family home built in the early 1900s. No stories, no legends, just a home that had changed hands several times over the decades. But this box told a different story. And Bailey, somehow, some way, had sensed it was here. I exhaled slowly, turning my attention to the bundle of papers beneath the photograph. My fingers worked carefully to unwrap the delicate blue cloth, revealing several sheets of yellowed paper covered in neat cursive. The ink had faded in places, but the words were still legible. Dearest Henry, if you are reading this, then my heart is at ease. It means someone has found this piece of us, that our love did not vanish with time. You always told me that love, real love, never fades. I believed you then, and I believe you now. Even if the world changes around us, even if years pass, what we shared will always be here. My breath caught in my throat. This wasn't just a random note. This was a love letter. A message meant for someone. Henry. I glanced at Bailey, who was watching me with those deep, knowing eyes of hers. It was as if she understood the significance of what we had found. My fingers tightened around the letter as I turned to the next page, my heart pounding with anticipation. I am sorry I had to leave. You know I would have stayed if I could. But life isn't always kind, and sometimes the choices we make aren't really choices at all. You told me you would wait, but I know that you deserved more than an empty promise. And so I left this here, knowing that one day someone would find it. Maybe even you. I pressed my lips together, my mind racing. Who was this woman? What had happened to her? And why had she hidden this letter instead of giving it to Henry directly? I flipped through the remaining pages, scanning the words for more clues. The letter continued, detailing memories, shared dreams, and moments that seemed both distant and heartbreakingly immediate. The woman, her name was Margaret, spoke of summer picnics by the lake, of stolen kisses under the old oak tree in the backyard, of whispered secrets and promises made beneath the stars. And then, near the end of the letter, a single line stood out. I buried this here, in the place where we first dreamed of forever. Our place. Bailey let out a soft whine, nudging my arm. I set the letter down carefully, my mind whirling with questions. If this had been their place, if this letter had been meant for Henry, had he ever found it? Had he ever come looking? Or had this message remained hidden for decades, its story forgotten? A cool breeze rustled the trees, sending a few leaves tumbling across the yard. The sun was nearly gone now, dipping below the horizon in a blaze of orange and pink. I glanced back at the box, at the bundle of letters that held a love story frozen in time. Bailey shifted beside me, leaning into my side, her warmth grounding me. We have to find out what happened to them, don't we? I murmured, running my hand over her soft fur. She responded with a slow, reassuring wag of her tail. I gathered up the letters, carefully placing them back into the cloth before tucking them into the chest. My mind was already spinning with possibilities: old records, property archives, maybe even a trip to the local library. Someone had to know the history of this house, and maybe, just maybe, I could find out what had become of Henry and Margaret. As I stood, Bailey followed, her tail swishing against the ground. I glanced down at her, smiling softly. "Looks like you led me to something special, girl." She barked once, almost as if in agreement, then trotted toward the porch, her golden fur glowing in the dimming light. I followed, gripping the chest tightly, already feeling the weight of the story unfolding in my hands. Whatever had happened all those years ago, whatever love had been lost or found, I had a feeling that Bailey and I were about to discover something truly extraordinary. And somehow, I knew that this was only the beginning. The next morning, I woke up with a restless energy buzzing through me. The old chest sat on my dining table, the letters carefully stacked inside. It felt like a piece of history had been dropped into my lap, and I couldn't ignore the feeling that I was meant to see this through. Bailey sat by my feet as I sipped my coffee, her head resting on my knee. She had been unusually calm since last night, as if she understood the gravity of our discovery. "We're going to find out what happened to them, girl," I murmured, scratching behind her ears. "We owe it to them." Bailey wagged her tail slightly, her warm brown eyes watching me with quiet understanding. I glanced at the chest again, then reached for my phone. If I was going to dig into the past, I needed to start with the most obvious source, the local historical records. After a few quick searches, I found the number for the county records office. I dialed and waited, tapping my fingers against the table. "Washington County Records, this is Sarah speaking. How can I help you?" I cleared my throat. "Hi, my name's Jake Evans. I live in a house that I believe was built in the early 1900s, and I recently found some old letters buried in the yard. I was wondering if you had any records on past owners." There was a pause. "That depends on how far back you're looking. We have property deeds and ownership transfers going back to about 1900. "That's perfect. The letters mention a couple from 1954. Their names were Margaret and Henry. I think they lived in my house." "All right, let me check our archives. It might take me a bit, but I can call you back once I find something." "Thank you. I appreciate it." I hung up and exhaled slowly. I was one step closer to understanding the story behind these letters. Bailey stretched beside me, then padded over to the back door, her tail wagging slightly. I smiled. "You want to go out?" She barked once, so I grabbed my jacket and followed her into the yard. The morning air was crisp, the grass still damp with dew. I wandered over to the hole where Bailey had been digging and crouched down. The chest was gone now, but the earth still showed signs of disturbance. Something about this spot felt significant. It wasn't just any patch of dirt. Margaret had chosen to bury her letters here for a reason. Maybe this had been their favorite place, their quiet refuge. Bailey sniffed the ground, then trotted off toward the large oak tree near the fence. I stood up and followed her, my thoughts still tangled with questions. If Margaret had left those letters, had Henry ever read them? Had he ever come back to look for them? The ringing of my phone jolted me from my thoughts. I pulled it out and answered quickly. "Hello?" "Hi, Mr. Evans. This is Sarah from the records office. I found something interesting." I straightened. "What did you find?" "Well, your house was originally owned by a Henry Callaway. He bought the property in 1951, but in 1955, the house was transferred to another owner, a William Carter. It looks like Henry sold it abruptly. Do you have any idea why? Sarah hesitated. There's no specific reason listed in the records, but from what I can tell, there were no legal issues. It seems like a personal decision. A knot tightened in my stomach. If Henry had left the house so suddenly, had he ever found Margaret's letters? Or had he moved away without knowing what she had left behind? Do you know where he went? I asked. I don't, but if he stayed in the area, there might be census records that could help. I can check and get back to you. That would be great. Thank you so much. I hung up and stared at the chest on the table. Henry had lived here. He had loved Margaret, and then, for some reason, he had left. Bailey nudged my hand, pulling me back to the present. I took a deep breath. If I wanted to find out the truth, I needed to keep digging. And I had a feeling that Bailey would be with me every step of the way. I spent the rest of the day researching online, searching for any trace of Henry Callaway. There were a few old newspaper clippings mentioning his name, but nothing concrete. Just as I was about to give up for the night, my phone rang again. Mr. Evans, it's Sarah again. I found something. Henry Callaway didn't leave town. He moved just a few miles away. And he's still alive. I nearly dropped my phone. He's alive? Yes, he's 92 years old now, living in a retirement home nearby. My pulse pounded. This was more than I had hoped for. Do you have an address? Sarah gave me the information, and I quickly jotted it down. Thank you, Sarah. This means a lot. You're welcome. Good luck. I hung up, my mind racing. Henry was still alive. That meant I could ask him what really happened all those years ago. I glanced at Bailey, who wagged her tail excitedly, as if sensing the importance of this moment. We're going on a trip tomorrow, girl, I said, rubbing her head. We're going to find Henry. She barked, as if in agreement, and I felt a new sense of determination settle over me. This wasn't just about uncovering history anymore. This was about giving an old love story the ending it deserved. The drive to the retirement home was quieter than I expected. Bailey sat in the passenger seat, her head resting on the console, watching me with that gentle but knowing gaze. The morning sun painted golden streaks across the windshield, the warmth battling against the cool air that still clung to the early hours. I couldn't stop my fingers from drumming on the steering wheel. The weight of what I was about to do settled in my chest like a stone. Henry Callaway. He wasn't just some name in an old letter anymore. He was real, breathing, living just a short drive away. And I was about to meet him. What if he didn't remember? What if he had spent a lifetime trying to forget? The questions buzzed in my mind, each one more persistent than the last. Bailey let out a soft huff, nudging my arm with her nose as if sensing my unease. I smiled, reaching over to scratch behind her ears. We'll figure it out together, won't we, girl? She wagged her tail, and for a brief moment my nerves settled. The retirement home sat on the outskirts of town, a well-kept brick building with sprawling gardens stretching along the perimeter. It was quiet, peaceful, the kind of place where time seemed to slow down. I parked the truck and took a deep breath before stepping out. Bailey hopped down beside me, her tail wagging lightly as we made our way to the front entrance. Inside, the air smelled faintly of lavender and fresh coffee. A receptionist looked up from her desk, offering a polite smile. Good morning. How can I help you? I cleared my throat. Hi, I'm looking for Henry Callaway. I was told he lives here. Her expression softened. Mr. Callaway? Yes, he's been here for a few years now. May I ask your relation to him? I'm not related, I admitted. Well, I found something that might belong to him. I was hoping to talk to him about it. She studied me for a moment before nodding. He's in the garden. It's his favorite place. Follow the hallway to the left, then head straight through the glass doors. She glanced down at Bailey. And she's well behaved, I assume? I chuckled. Better than most people I know. She smiled and waved us through. Go ahead. Bailey and I made our way down the quiet hallway, my heart thudding louder with each step. The garden opened up in front of us, a sea of greenery with winding paths and blooming flowers. And there, sitting on a wooden bench beneath a large oak tree, was an old man, Henry Callaway. His silver hair was neatly combed, his frame lean but strong for his age. He sat with his hands clasped over his lap, gazing at the sky as if lost in thought. As we approached, Bailey's ears perked up, and she trotted ahead, stopping just short of Henry's feet. She let out a small whine, her tail wagging gently. Henry blinked, then looked down at her with surprise. "Well, hello there," he murmured, his voice warm and steady. He reached out, running a hand over Bailey's head. "Aren't you a beautiful girl?" I cleared my throat, stepping closer. "Mr. Callaway?" He lifted his gaze to me, his blue eyes sharp despite his age. "Yes?" I swallowed, feeling the weight of the moment settle on my shoulders. "My name's Jake Evans. I live in a house not too far from here. I found something buried in my backyard." His brows furrowed slightly. "Buried?" I nodded, reaching into my bag and carefully pulling out the bundle of letters wrapped in the faded blue cloth. These. They were hidden in the ground, in a wooden chest. They belonged to someone named Margaret. For a moment, there was silence. Henry stared at the cloth in my hands, his expression unreadable. Then, ever so slowly, his hands trembled as he reached out and took them from me. He unfolded the cloth, his fingers brushing against the delicate pages. As he read, his breath hitched, and I saw his throat work as he swallowed. His eyes, once so steady, shimmered with something deep and unspoken. "Margaret," he whispered. Bailey pressed against my leg, as if sensing the gravity of the moment. I waited, giving Henry the space he needed. The world around us seemed to slow, the rustling leaves and distant bird calls the only sounds filling the silence. After what felt like an eternity, Henry let out a shaky breath and closed his eyes. "She left these here. All this time." His voice broke slightly, but he steadied himself. "I waited for her, you know, for years." I shifted. "What happened?" Henry hesitated, as if weighing how much to say. Then, with a sigh, he looked at me. "We were young. We had plans, big, beautiful plans. But Margaret's family didn't approve of me. Her father wanted her to marry someone else, someone with money, stability. She tried to fight it, but in the end, she had no choice. She was sent away, and I never saw her again." I swallowed hard. "She wrote that she never stopped loving you." Henry's eyes shone with something both painful and tender. "And I never stopped loving her." I sat beside him on the bench, the weight of the moment settling between us. "She wrote these for you. She buried them in a place that meant something to both of you. I think she hoped you would find them." He chuckled softly, though it was tinged with sorrow. "I never thought to look. I assumed she was gone, that she had moved on. But she never did she?" I shook my head. "No." Henry closed his eyes for a long moment, then exhaled. "Thank you, Jake. You and that dog of yours. You brought me something I never thought I'd have again, a piece of her." Bailey nudged his knee, and he smiled, running a hand through her fur. "You're a good girl, aren't you? Smart, too. You knew, didn't you?" She wagged her tail, and I found myself smiling despite the lump in my throat. She's got a way of finding things. Henry nodded, his gaze drifting back to the letters. "I'd like to take some time with these, to remember her." "Of course," I said, standing. "Take all the time you need." As I turned to leave, Bailey hesitated, looking up at Henry one last time before trotting after me. I glanced back, watching as Henry held the letters close, his fingers tracing the delicate pages, lost in a love that time had never truly erased. I knew this wasn't the end of the story. Not yet. There was still more to uncover, more to understand. But for now, I had done what I was meant to do. And Bailey, well, she had led me exactly where I needed to be. The drive home from the retirement home was quiet. Bailey sat in her usual spot in the passenger seat, staring out the window, her ears twitching occasionally at the passing scenery. My hands gripped the steering wheel, my mind still processing everything that had happened. Meeting Henry Callaway had given the story of Margaret and Henry new weight. This wasn't just a love story lost to time. It was a real, living history that had been buried for decades, waiting to be uncovered. Henry had held on to the letters as if they were the most valuable thing in the world. Maybe to him, they were. He had spent his life believing Margaret had disappeared, forced into a life without him. Yet she had left behind these letters, these pieces of her heart, hoping he would one day find them. And he never did. Until now. I pulled into my driveway and shut off the engine, exhaling slowly. Bailey stretched in the seat, then hopped down as soon as I opened the door. She trotted toward the backyard, nose to the ground as if searching for more secrets hidden beneath the earth. I followed, staring at the patch of disturbed soil where the chest had been buried. It was strange to think that only days ago this had been nothing but an ordinary part of my yard. Now, it was the key to a love story that had almost been lost forever. Bailey sniffed around for a moment before sitting beside the spot, her tail wagging slowly. "Nothing else, girl?" I murmured, running a hand over her head. She looked up at me with those big, knowing eyes, then leaned into my touch. Inside, I made a cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table, staring at the notepad where I had scribbled down notes about Henry and Margaret. I knew there was more to uncover. Margaret had been forced to leave, but what had happened to her after that? Had she married someone else? Had she spent her life thinking about Henry just as he had thought about her? There was only one way to find out. I grabbed my laptop and started searching. The first place I checked was the county archives, scanning for any records of Margaret's last name. It took time, but after a while I found a record of a Margaret Whitmore, her maiden name, who had married in 1956, just 2 years after Henry had sold the house. The name of her husband made my stomach twist. William Carter, the same man who had purchased Henry's home in 1955. I sat back in my chair, running a hand over my face. Margaret had married the very man who had taken over the house she and Henry had once shared dreams about. Had it been her choice? Or had her family forced her into it? Bailey let out a soft whine, resting her head on my knee. I rubbed her ears absently, my mind racing. There was more to this. Much more. I dug deeper, searching for anything that could tell me what had happened to Margaret after her marriage. I found census records, small mentions in newspaper clippings about local events, and eventually an obituary. Margaret Carter, loving wife and mother, had passed away in 2002. The words felt heavier than they should have. She was gone. The woman who had written those letters, who had loved Henry with all her heart, had lived an entire life after being separated from him. And Henry had never known. I closed my laptop, my chest tight. There was one more person who might know the missing pieces of this story. Margaret's family. If she had children, if she had grandchildren, they might have some insight into the life she had led. Maybe, just maybe, they knew if she had ever spoken about Henry. I wasn't sure what I was hoping for. Some confirmation that she had loved Henry until the end? That she had kept their memories close to her heart? Or maybe I just wanted to give Henry the closure he had been denied all these years. The next morning I woke early, the need to see this through pushing me forward. Bailey wagged her tail excitedly as I grabbed my keys and headed out the door. I had found an address linked to one of Margaret's children, a man named Thomas Carter. He lived just a few towns over, in a quiet neighborhood lined with old oak trees and well-kept lawns. I parked outside his house and took a deep breath. This was the part that made me the most nervous, knocking on a stranger's door and telling them I had uncovered a buried love story between their mother and a man they might have never even heard of. I walked up the porch steps and knocked. After a few moments, the door creaked open, and a man in his 60s peered out, his expression wary. "Can I help you?" "Mr. Carter, my name is Jake Evans. I know this might seem strange, but I recently found some letters buried in my yard. They belonged to a woman named Margaret Whitmore, later Margaret Carter. I believe she was your mother." His eyes narrowed slightly, but there was no hostility in his gaze, just curiosity. "Letters from my mother?" I nodded. "They were meant for someone named Henry Callaway. She left them buried in the backyard of the house I now own." Thomas was silent for a moment, then pushed the door open wider. "You better come in." I stepped inside, Bailey following at my heels. The house was warm and inviting, decorated with family photos and the scent of fresh coffee lingering in the air. Thomas led me to the living room and gestured for me to sit. "I have to admit," he said, settling into his own chair, "I wasn't expecting a conversation like this today." I smiled faintly. I wasn't expecting to find a box of buried love letters either, but here we are. He let out a soft chuckle. "You said these were letters from my mother? To Henry Callaway?" "Yes. They were love letters. She wrote about how much she loved him, how she never wanted to leave but had no choice. She buried them in the yard, hoping he would find them." I hesitated before adding, "He never did. Not until now." Thomas's expression softened. "I knew about Henry. My mother never talked much about her past, but I remember her having a box of old keepsakes. One time, when I was a teenager, I found a photograph of a man. When I asked her about it, she just smiled sadly and said, 'That was a man I once loved.'" My throat tightened. She never forgot him. "No," Thomas murmured. "She never did." I leaned forward. "Henry is still alive. He's 92 years old now. When I showed him the letters, it was the first time he had seen them. He thought she had moved on without a second thought." Thomas looked down at his hands. "She moved on because she had to, not because she wanted to. I think a part of her always wondered if he had waited, but she never had the chance to find out." I nodded slowly. "Would you be willing to meet him? I think he'd love to know more about the woman he never stopped loving." Thomas was silent for a long moment. Then he exhaled and gave a small nod. "Yeah, I think she would have wanted that." Bailey let out a soft huff beside me, her tail wagging gently as if she knew we had just taken another step toward something that had been waiting to be resolved for far too long. The morning air was crisp as I pulled into the driveway of the retirement home, my hands gripping the steering wheel tighter than usual. Bailey sat beside me, her head slightly tilted, sensing my nerves. In the passenger seat was Thomas Carter, his expression unreadable as he stared out the window. He hadn't said much during the drive, and I hadn't pushed him to. This was a moment that carried weight, one that didn't need to be rushed with empty conversation. I turned off the engine and exhaled slowly. "Are you ready?" Thomas hesitated, then gave a small nod. "As ready as I'll ever be." Bailey hopped down first as I opened the door, stretching before trotting ahead. I led Thomas through the entrance of the retirement home, where the receptionist greeted us with a warm smile. "Good morning, Mr. Evans. Mr. Callaway is in the garden again." I thanked her and guided Thomas down the familiar hallway, the weight in my chest growing heavier with each step. Bailey stayed close to my side, her tail wagging gently, her presence a silent reassurance. As we stepped into the garden, I spotted Henry in the same spot as before, sitting beneath the oak tree, the bundle of letters resting on his lap. He looked up at the sound of footsteps, his gaze settling on Thomas. For a moment, time seemed to slow. Henry's expression shifted, a flicker of recognition crossing his aged features. "You look familiar." Thomas cleared his throat. "My name is Thomas Carter. Margaret was my mother." Henry inhaled sharply, his hands tightening around the letters. His lips parted, but no words came out immediately. He blinked, his breath unsteady, as if the reality of the moment was sinking in too fast. "Margaret's son." His voice trembled slightly. "She had a son." Thomas nodded, his own voice tight with emotion. "She did. And I think she would have wanted me to meet you." Bailey sat down between them, looking from one to the other, as if urging them to bridge the space between their worlds. Henry swallowed hard, glancing down at the letters before lifting his gaze again. Did she ever speak of me?" Thomas hesitated only briefly before answering. "Not often, but when she did, it was always with a kind of sadness, like she was holding on to something she couldn't quite let go of." Henry exhaled slowly, his eyes glistening. "I waited for her, you know. I wanted to believe she'd find a way back. But life had other plans." Thomas looked down for a moment, then back up at Henry. "She never stopped loving you. Even when she moved on, even when she built a life with my father, I think a part of her heart always belonged to you." Henry let out a shaky breath, his fingers trembling as he traced the edges of the letters. "I never got to say goodbye. I never got to tell her that I understood, that I didn't blame her." Thomas shifted, reaching into his coat pocket. "I brought something," he said, pulling out a small, worn leather notebook. "I found this among her things after she passed. It's filled with notes, little thoughts she wrote down over the years. There's something in here I think you should see." He flipped through the pages, stopping at one in particular before handing it over. Henry took the notebook with careful hands, his eyes scanning the handwritten words. His breath hitched as he read aloud. "There is a place where love never fades, where time cannot steal what was meant to be. If I could go back, I'd find you there. I hope you know my heart never truly left." Henry closed his eyes, a single tear escaping down his cheek. Thomas looked away, giving the older man a moment to absorb it. Bailey rested her head on Henry's knee, her quiet presence filling the silence with something steady, something grounding. Henry opened his eyes again, and for the first time since I'd met him, He smiled. Not a bittersweet smile, not one filled with sorrow, but something softer. "She remembered," he whispered. "Even after all those years, she remembered." Thomas nodded. She did. The two men sat in silence for a long while, lost in the weight of the past, the moments that had been missed, and the ones still left to share. And in that quiet, with the rustling of leaves and the soft panting of Bailey between them, something unspoken passed between them. A connection forged not by shared history, but by the love of the same woman who had tied their lives together without them ever realizing it. When Henry finally looked up again, his gaze was steady. "Thank you for bringing this to me. It means more than I can say." Thomas gave a small, understanding smile. "I think she would have wanted you to have it." Henry looked down at the notebook, running his fingers over the worn leather cover, then back at the bundle of letters beside him. "Would you sit with me for a while? Tell me about her?" Thomas hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, I'd like that." As they settled into conversation, Bailey let out a content sigh, curling up beside them. I stepped back slightly, giving them the space they needed. This moment wasn't mine to take. It belonged to them, to Henry, and to Margaret, and to the love that had never truly been lost. I watched as the two men shared stories, filling in the gaps of a history that had been waiting to be pieced back together. The sun shone down on them, warming the crisp air, as if the universe itself was bearing witness to a love that had finally found its way home. And as Bailey lifted her head, her eyes meeting mine, I knew we had done what we were meant to do. But somehow, I also knew this wasn't the end of the story, just another chapter in something much bigger than any of us could have imagined. The afternoon sun cast golden streaks across the garden as Henry and Thomas remained seated beneath the oak tree, their conversation unfolding like an old book finally being read after years of dust collecting on its pages. Bailey lay at their feet, occasionally shifting to nuzzle Henry's hand or glance up at me with those knowing eyes of hers. I stayed close, but silent, sensing that this was a moment best observed rather than interrupted. Henry's voice, though worn with age, held a warmth I hadn't heard before. She used to hum when she was nervous, just a little tune under her breath. It wasn't something anyone else noticed, but I did. Every time we danced, every time we sat in silence, and that tune was there. Thomas smiled, shaking his head. She used to do that when she was cooking. I always thought it was just a habit. Guess I never realized why. Henry chuckled softly, tracing the edge of the notebook with his fingers. She was always thinking, always feeling things deeply, even when she couldn't say them out loud. Thomas hesitated before speaking again. She kept a drawer of old letters. Not yours. I suppose she didn't have those. But little notes she wrote to herself. It was like she was keeping track of her heart. Henry looked up, his expression unreadable for a moment. Then he sighed. I wish I had known. All these years, I thought she had moved on without a second thought. But she never really let go, did she? Thomas shook his head. Not really. I could feel the weight of those words settling over them like a blanket of quiet understanding. Some people move on, let the past fade into distant memory. But some loves don't allow for that. Some remain, etched into the fabric of who they are, even when time tries to erase them. Bailey stood then, stretching before making her way over to Henry, resting her head against his knee. He smiled down at her, running his hand along the soft fur of her back. Smart girl, aren't you? You knew this needed to be found. Bailey's tail thumped lightly against the ground as if she understood the significance of what was happening. The garden remained quiet, except for the rustling of leaves in the breeze. Henry's fingers hovered over the pages of Margaret's notebook before he finally spoke again. What was she like? Later in life, I mean. Thomas took a deep breath. She was kind, strong, even when she didn't have to be. She loved my father, I think, in her own way. But there were moments, he trailed off, as if trying to find the right words. Sometimes I'd catch her staring at the lake near our house, or holding an old photograph. I never knew what she was thinking. But now I think I do. Henry nodded slowly. She was thinking of what could have been. The weight of the conversation was almost too much, so I cleared my throat and shifted in my seat. Henry, do you want to keep the notebook? Henry looked down at it again, his fingers brushing lightly over the worn leather. I think I do, if Thomas doesn't mind. Thomas gave a small smile. I think it belongs to you as much as it belonged to her. Henry held the notebook to his chest for a moment, eyes closing briefly before he exhaled, and set it carefully beside the bundle of letters. You know, I thought I'd carry this regret forever, but somehow knowing she never forgot, that eases something in me. Bailey let out a soft sigh, as if in agreement. After a while, Thomas checked his watch and stretched. I should probably head home, but Henry, if you ever want to talk again, I'd like that. Henry's expression softened. I'd like that too. As we walked back to the car, Bailey trotting between us, I turned to Thomas. How do you feel? Thomas exhaled slowly. Lighter, I think. It's strange. I spent my whole life knowing my mother as one person, but now I realize there was a part of her I never really knew, and that part still mattered. I nodded. She mattered to Henry too. Thomas glanced back toward the garden, where Henry still sat under the oak tree, lost in the past, but finally at peace with it. Yeah, and I think that's what she would have wanted. Bailey let out a quiet bark, as if declaring that everything had fallen into place just as it should. And as we pulled away from the retirement home, I had the distinct feeling that while this chapter was coming to a close, the story wasn't over just yet. The days that followed were quiet, yet the weight of what had happened lingered in the back of my mind. Henry had his answers. Thomas had a new understanding of his mother. And yet I couldn't shake the feeling that there was still something unfinished about all of this. Bailey seemed to sense it too. She had led me to the letters, to Henry, and to Thomas. But now, she was restless, pacing near the backyard, as if there was still something she needed to uncover. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm amber glow over the yard, I stood at the edge of where Bailey had first started digging. She sniffed around the area, occasionally stopping to scratch at the dirt. I crouched down beside her, running my fingers through the cool soil. What is it, girl? Do you think there's something else here? I murmured. Bailey wagged her tail, but kept her focus on the ground. I sighed and grabbed the small shovel I had left leaning against the fence. If she was still searching for something, I wasn't about to ignore her instincts. I started digging, the dirt coming up in soft clumps as the hole deepened. The air grew cooler as the sky darkened, and just as I was about to give up for the night, my shovel hit something solid. Bailey barked, stepping closer, her nose twitching. I knelt down, brushing away the remaining dirt until I uncovered what looked like another small wooden box. My heart pounded as I carefully lifted it from the earth, wiping away the dust that had settled over its surface. The box was old, but unlike the first one, this one had a small latch on the front. With slightly trembling fingers, I unhooked the latch and slowly lifted the lid. Inside was another bundle of letters, wrapped neatly in a piece of faded fabric. But these weren't Margaret's letters. The handwriting was different. Strong, bold strokes, as though each word had been written with conviction. I unfolded the first letter and began to read. Margaret, if you ever find this, I need you to know, I never stopped looking for you. I waited for word, for some sign, but when nothing came, I feared the worst. I feared you were gone, that I had lost you forever. I buried this here because I couldn't bear the thought of leaving without a part of you still with me. I exhaled slowly, my grip tightening around the fragile paper. These weren't just any letters. These were Henry's. I read through a few more, each one carrying the same longing, the same sadness, the same hope that somehow, against all odds, Margaret would find them. He had written to her even when he thought she was lost to him. He had poured his heart into these pages, just as she had done with hers. Bailey nudged my side, breaking me from my trance. I looked down at her and ran a hand through her fur. You were right, girl. There was still more to the story. That night, I barely slept. I stayed up reading each letter, feeling as though I was reliving every moment of Henry and Margaret's lost love. And in the morning, as the first light of dawn crept through my window, I knew what I had to do. I drove back to the retirement home, the box of letters sitting on the passenger seat beside Bailey. Henry had to see this. He had to know that his words had not been lost forever. When I arrived, the receptionist recognized me immediately and waved me through. Henry was sitting in the same spot under the oak tree, gazing at the sky as if lost in thought. When he saw me approaching, he smiled faintly. Back so soon? I nodded, holding up the box. I found something. His eyes widened slightly as I sat down beside him, placing the box in his lap. What is this? Your letters, Henry. The ones you wrote to Margaret. His breath caught. He stared at the box for a long moment, his fingers trembling slightly as he lifted the lid. He pulled out the first letter, unfolding it carefully. I watched as he read, his expression shifting from shock to disbelief to something that looked like quiet acceptance. I thought they were lost, he whispered. I thought she never knew. I swallowed hard. She didn't, but now they're here. And maybe that means something. Henry closed his eyes for a long moment, then exhaled deeply. All these years, I thought I had lost her forever. But she was always with me, wasn't she? In these words, in these letters. I nodded. She never forgot you, Henry. And you never forgot her. Bailey placed her head on Henry's knee, her tail wagging gently. He smiled down at her, running a hand over her soft fur. You've got a special one here, he murmured. She sees things we don't. I chuckled. Yeah, she does. Henry continued to read, his fingers tracing each word as if committing them to memory. When he reached the last letter, he looked up at me. Thank you, Jake, for bringing her back to me. I smiled. I think Bailey deserves most of the credit. He let out a soft chuckle, nodding. That she does. As we sat there in the quiet of the garden, I realized something. This story, this love that had been buried for decades, had finally been given the chance to breathe again. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. Bailey let out a content sigh, curling up between us. The past had been uncovered. The letters had been read. And though time had moved on, love had never truly faded. And for the first time, I felt certain that this journey, wherever it was leading, was far from over. The following morning, I sat on my porch, sipping my coffee while Bailey lay stretched out at my feet, her tail flicking lazily. The previous day's events weighed on me in a way I hadn't quite expected. Henry had his letters now. He had proof that Margaret had never forgotten him, just as he had never forgotten her. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something still lingered, something unresolved. Bailey lifted her head, ears twitching as if she sensed my thoughts. I reached down and scratched behind her ears. "What do you think, girl? Are we really done here?" She didn't respond, of course, but the way she suddenly stood and trotted toward the backyard told me everything I needed to know. She wasn't done yet, and neither was I. I followed her to the spot where we had first discovered Margaret's letters. Bailey sniffed around the area before sitting, looking up at me expectantly. "All right," I muttered, grabbing the small shovel I had left nearby. "One more time." The soil was still loose from our last dig, making it easier to move. As I dug deeper, I half expected to hit nothing, to find that whatever needed to be uncovered had already been found. But then, just as I was about to stop, my shovel scraped against something hard. Bailey let out a small bark, her tail wagging furiously. My pulse quickened as I dropped to my knees and began brushing away the dirt with my hands. It was another box, similar to the first, but smaller, with a rusted lock that crumbled the moment I touched it. With a deep breath, I lifted the lid. Inside, there was only one thing, a single letter, folded neatly. I carefully picked it up, unfolding it to reveal delicate, slanted handwriting. Margaret's handwriting. "My dearest Henry, if you are reading this, then perhaps fate has found a way to bring us together again, even if only through words. I have carried you with me every day of my life, and though the years have passed, my heart has remained yours. I wanted to leave this letter in case I never had the chance to say what I should have said long ago. I never stopped loving you, not for a single moment. The life I led was not the one I dreamed of, but I found joy where I could. I hope you did too. I don't know if you ever searched for me, but if you did, know that I searched for you too. There were days I nearly walked up to our old house, days I wanted to knock on the door and see if you were still there. But I never did. I was afraid that too much time had passed, that we had become nothing more than memories. If this letter has found you, know that my last thoughts were of you. I hope you found happiness, Henry. I hope you lived a life full of love, even if it wasn't with me. Yours, always. Margaret. I stared at the letter, my throat tightening. Margaret had written this knowing she might never see Henry again. She had left it behind as a final message, a last piece of her heart buried in the place that had once been theirs. Bailey nudged my hand gently, as if sensing the weight of the moment. "Yeah, girl," I whispered. "I think we need to take this to Henry." By the time I arrived at the retirement home, Henry was once again in his favorite spot under the oak tree, the box of letters still sitting beside him. He looked up as I approached, his eyes questioning. "I found something else," I said, my voice quieter than I intended. His brow furrowed, but he reached out as I handed him the letter. The moment his fingers touched the paper, something in his expression shifted. Recognition, pain, hope, all wrapped into one. He unfolded it slowly, his eyes scanning the words. I watched as his lips trembled, his hands tightening around the edges of the letter as though he was afraid it might disappear. Bailey sat beside him, her gaze steady and comforting. Henry read every word carefully, then lowered the letter to his lap, exhaling a breath that sounded like it had been held for a lifetime. "She never stopped looking for me," he murmured. "She wanted to find me." I nodded. "She did. And even though she didn't, she left this for you. She wanted you to know." Henry wiped at his eyes, shaking his head with a small, broken chuckle. "All these years I thought I was alone in my memories. But she was there too, carrying the same love, the same pain." We sat in silence for a while, the weight of the past settling between us. Finally, Henry straightened, carefully folding the letter and placing it inside the box with the others. "Thank you, Jake," he said, looking at me with an expression so full of gratitude that I felt my own chest tighten. "You and that dog of yours. You've given me something I never thought I'd have." Bailey let out a soft huff, her tail wagging gently. I chuckled. "She's got a way of knowing things." Henry smiled, running a hand over Bailey's fur. "That she does." As I drove home that evening, Bailey curled up beside me. I felt something shift inside me. This journey had started with a dog digging in my backyard, but it had led to something far greater than I ever could have imagined. Henry had his closure. Margaret had left behind her final words. And while their love had never been given the chance to bloom in the way it was meant to, it had still endured. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. Bailey sighed contentedly, resting her head on my lap. I glanced down at her, a soft smile pulling at my lips. "Good job, girl. Good job. Good." The next few days passed in a quiet haze, yet something about the air around me felt lighter. It was as if a story, long buried, had finally been given the chance to breathe again. Henry had his closure, or at least as much of it as was possible after decades of longing. Margaret's final words had reached him, words she had never been able to say in person. And Bailey, well, Bailey had done what she always did best. She had found something that no one else would have, bringing two souls back together in a way neither of them could have ever expected. But I still had a feeling that this wasn't over. Bailey hadn't stopped her pacing. She had spent every morning in the backyard, sniffing the area near where the boxes had been found, occasionally pausing to dig at the ground, as if expecting something else to be waiting for her. I watched her closely, wondering if she was just restless, or if there really was something more beneath the surface. One evening, as the sky turned shades of orange and pink, I finally gave in. "All right, girl, one last time." Bailey barked excitedly, as if she had been waiting for me to say that all along. I grabbed the shovel and started digging, the soil now familiar beneath my fingers. I wasn't sure what I was expecting, maybe another letter, another clue to Henry and Margaret's story. But what I found was different. The metal clink of my shovel against something hard made me pause. Bailey whined, her tail wagging eagerly. I dropped to my knees and brushed away the dirt with my hands, until I uncovered what looked like an old, rusted key. A key? My brows furrowed as I lifted it from the dirt. It was heavy, ornate, like something from an old house or a trunk. There was no note this time, no explanation, just this single object left behind. Bailey sniffed it and let out a short bark as if urging me to figure out where it belonged. I stood, the key clutched in my hand, my mind spinning. If this had been left buried here, then it must have meant something to either Henry or Margaret. The only place I could think to look was Henry's old house, the one Margaret's family had taken from him, the one she had spent her life avoiding. And I knew exactly where to find it. The next morning, I made the drive out to the address I had found in the county records. The house was still there, standing proud despite its age. The yard was overgrown, The paint chipped in places, but the structure itself was intact. I approached the front door, Bailey at my side, my heart hammering in my chest. The key felt cold in my hand as I pressed it into the lock, half expecting it not to fit. But it did. With a quiet click, the door swung open. The air inside was thick with dust, the scent of time and abandonment clinging to every surface. Furniture covered in white sheets stood like ghosts in the dim light, filtering through the drawn curtains. I stepped inside cautiously, Bailey close at my heels. Every creak of the wooden floor beneath my feet felt like an echo of the past. I moved carefully through the house, taking in the remnants of a life that had once been lived here. Old photographs still lined the mantel, though their faces had faded over time. A bookshelf stood against one wall, filled with novels that looked untouched for years. Bailey sniffed the air, then suddenly trotted forward with purpose, heading toward the hallway. I followed her, my pulse quickening. She stopped in front of a small door at the end of the hall, one I assumed led to a storage room or basement. She let out a soft whine, pawing at the wood. I hesitated only for a moment before reaching for the handle. The door groaned as it opened, revealing a set of stairs leading downward. My grip on the key tightened as I descended, Bailey's soft footsteps following behind me. The basement was dim, the only light coming from a small window near the ceiling. In the center of the room, covered in dust and time, was an old wooden trunk. Bailey barked, stepping toward it as if confirming that this was what we had been searching for. I knelt in front of it, brushing off the years of neglect that had settled over its surface. There was a keyhole on the front, and my heart pounded as I slid the key inside. It turned smoothly. The lid creaked as I lifted it, and inside, carefully wrapped in faded fabric, were more letters. But these were different. The handwriting wasn't Margaret's, nor was it Henry's. I picked one up and unfolded it, my eyes scanning the first few lines. To my dearest Margaret, I don't know if you will ever see this, but I cannot let my heart carry this secret any longer. I paused, my breath catching in my throat. This wasn't Henry's writing, but someone else's. I did what I had to do, what I thought was best. Your father made me promise I would never tell you the truth, but I cannot take this secret to my grave. He told me if I loved you, I would let you go. And so I did. My pulse pounded. This wasn't a letter of love, it was a confession. I read further, my hands tightening around the paper. I bought the house not to take it from you, but to make sure it was always here, waiting for you, should you ever want to return. But I see now that I was wrong to keep this from you. I see now that I was never the right person for you. And for that, I am sorry. I sat back, the letter trembling in my grasp. William Carter, Margaret's husband, had written these letters. And from the sound of it, he had known all along that Margaret had loved Henry. He had kept this house, had buried his own regret, had lived with the knowledge that the woman he married had given her heart to someone else. Bailey nudged my arm, bringing me back to the present. I looked down at the other letters, wondering how many more confessions lay within them. I needed to bring these to Henry. He deserved to know the truth. Not just that Margaret had loved him, but that someone else had known it too. That her life had been shaped not by choice, but by obligation and silence. I carefully placed the letters back into the trunk, my mind racing. This story wasn't over. Not yet. And with Bailey leading the way, I knew we were about to uncover even more than we had ever expected. I drove back to the retirement home with the trunk of letters resting on the seat beside me. Bailey sat in the passenger seat, her ears perked, sensing the importance of this moment. My thoughts raced, What would Henry think? Would he be angry? Relieved? Heartbroken all over again? When I arrived, the receptionist waved me through without question. She had seen me enough times now to know that whatever I was here for, it mattered. Henry was in his usual spot under the oak tree. His face lit up when he saw Bailey, who trotted over and nuzzled his leg before curling up at his feet. Then his gaze shifted to me, to the heavy wooden trunk I carried, and his brow furrowed. "What's this?" he asked, his voice laced with curiosity and caution. I set the trunk down beside him and took a deep breath. "I found something. Something I think you need to see." His hands, still strong despite his age, trembled slightly as he reached for the latch. The trunk creaked open, revealing the carefully wrapped letters. He hesitated before picking one up, his eyes scanning the unfamiliar handwriting. I sat beside him, watching his expression shift as he read. At first there was confusion, then shock, then something else. Something deeper. "William," he murmured, recognizing the name at the bottom of the letter. I nodded. "Margaret's husband. He wrote these." Henry's fingers traced the delicate paper. "He knew," he whispered. "He knew all along." The weight of that truth settled between us. Henry continued reading, his eyes growing misty as the words sank in. William had known about Margaret's love for Henry. He had bought the house not to take it away from Henry, but to preserve it for her. He had let her go because he thought it was the right thing to do. But in the end, he had carried that regret with him, never able to voice the truth while Margaret was alive. "I spent my whole life thinking she had forgotten me," Henry said finally, his voice thick with emotion. But she hadn't, and neither had he. I didn't know what to say. There were no words that could undo the past, no way to make up for all the lost time. But at least now, Henry knew. He knew the truth. Bailey lifted her head, looking up at Henry as if waiting for him to say something more. He reached down, stroking her fur with a small, wistful smile. "She would have loved you, Bailey. You have a way of finding what's been lost." He set the letter down gently, looking at me with a new kind of resolve in his eyes. "Jake, would you take me there? To the house?" He nodded. "I need to see it. One last time." The drive was quiet, filled only with the soft hum of the road beneath us. Henry sat in the passenger seat, gazing out the window, lost in thought. When we pulled up to the old house, he exhaled slowly. I helped him out of the car, and together we walked through the overgrown yard. He ran a hand along the wooden railing of the porch, his fingers brushing against the peeling paint. "It still feels like ours," he murmured. I handed him the key, the same one I had unearthed in my backyard. "Go ahead." He turned it in the lock, and the door creaked open. The air inside smelled of dust and time, but there was something else. Something familiar. Henry stepped inside slowly, his eyes moving over the furniture, the walls, the small details that had once made this house a home. He walked down the hallway, pausing in front of the door that led to the basement. Bailey sat at his feet, watching, waiting. He turned the handle and stepped inside. The basement was dim, the same way I had left it. The trunk sat in the center of the room, the rest of the letters still neatly inside. Henry knelt beside it, running a hand over the lid. He didn't open it. He just sat there for a long time, breathing in the space, letting the past settle around him. Finally, he looked up at me. "Thank you, Jake, for finding this. For finding me." I swallowed hard, nodding. I think Bailey deserves most of the credit. He chuckled softly. That she does. We stood in silence for a moment, the weight of everything pressing against us. Then Henry reached into his pocket and pulled out something small. A folded piece of paper. He held it out to me. I wrote this a long time ago. For Margaret. I never got to give it to her. I hesitated before taking it, unfolding the fragile paper. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of a lifetime. Margaret, if love is measured in time, then I have loved you for eternity. Henry exhaled, his hands resting on the trunk. I think it's time to let go now. I nodded, understanding. Some stories don't need a perfect ending. Some just need to be told. We left the house as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the yard. Bailey trotted beside Henry, her tail wagging slightly. And as we drove away, I knew that no matter how much time had passed, some loves never truly fade. They just wait, buried beneath the surface until they are found again.